We also have the blessing of hearing from some of Harry's students. Again, their names are on the program and can come up in the order that they're listed. So Edward J. Erler, Thomas G. West, Michael M. Uhlmann, and Larry P. Arnn.
Well, it was nearly 50 years ago that I arrived in Claremont to study with Harry Jaffa and his teacher, Leo Strauss. First course I took from Dr. Jaffa was a year-long seminar on Plato's Republic. We made our way through the first 2 books. This was my introduction to close textual reading. When he set his mind to it, few were better at textual analysis than Dr. Jaffa. I subsequently took other seminars on Plato from Dr. Jaffa, as well as courses on Aristotle, Shakespeare, Abraham Lincoln. I must say the breadth of his interests and the depth of his understanding were on constant display in these seminars. Dr. Jaffa also introduced me to Professor Harry Newman, who taught philosophy at Scripps College and the graduate school. I took several seminars from Professor Newman, who was a first-rate Nietzsche scholar. And Professors Jaffa and Newman gave a joint seminar together every year for at least 10 years. And since my own teaching career allowed me to live in Claremont, I was able to attend many of these seminars over the years. And although the seminar topics varied, it was always a debate between Aristotle and Nietzsche. And it took place on the highest level, surprisingly without polemics or acrimony. For me, it was a wonderful experience, listening to perhaps the most profound students of 2 of the greatest philosophers. The seminars and these professors had a great influence on me. Professor Newman died last year. I will miss both professors greatly. They were profound influences in my life. Professor Jaffa also introduced me to competitive cycling. We spent many hours training and racing together. I think it's appropriate that his steed is here on display. He was proud of this bicycle. It was the same bicycle that the greatest cyclist in the history of cycling, Eddie Merckx, rode to his in his famous career. We were neighbors and we became friends. And eventually, in his declining years, I became the trustee of his estate. What a journey. Who would have thought? But a marvelous one it was, a lifelong seminar spent with an outstanding political philosopher. Dr. Jaffa was mostly known for his work on Abraham Lincoln, but he was also a student of Shakespeare and Aristotle, as well as the statesmanship of Winston Churchill. His essay on the unity of tragedy, comedy, and history and interpretation of the Shakespearean universe alone is sufficient to secure his place as a preeminent interpreter of Shakespeare. And his early essay on Aristotle, as well as his early book, Thomism and Aristotelianism, might have launched a career as an outstanding commentator on the philosopher's work. But he saw a more urgent task in directing himself to the study of America, and he was the first of Leo Strauss's students to do so. Now, Leo Strauss wrote in the context of the crisis of the West. Professor Jaffa extended Strauss's analysis to the crisis of America. Indeed, it was Dr. Jaffa's contention that the crisis of American constitutionalism is the crisis of the West. These words, written in the early 1990s, seem particularly apt today, as America enters what some constitutional scholars have called the post-constitutional era, and the West lapses into paralysis, seemingly uncertain of its purpose and unable or unwilling to defend itself against its enemies. Professor Strauss had written that the unresolved contest between reason and revelation is the secret vitality of Western civilization. Dr. Jaffa wrote that the American founding preserved this vitality by recognizing equally the claims of both reason and revelation, and thereby made constitutional government possible by excluding sectarian issues from political life. In this way, Jaffa wrote, the very difference between Jerusalem and Athens become the highest ground of harmony and peace. If Jaffa is correct, and I am convinced that he is, the American founding, and only the American founding, preserves the vitality of the West. Dr. Jaffa's best-known work is Crisis of the House Divided, an interpretation of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and this was published in 1959. This book was the first to argue the importance of the Lincoln-Douglas debates for the understanding of American political principles. Historians and political scientists, of course, had acknowledged the existence of the debates, but no one before Dr. Jaffa had believed that they were worthy of extended analysis. He discovered in the debates the key to understanding the very soul of American politics and the principles that animated those politics. The soul of America was exposed in its greatest crisis, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates were the prelude to that crisis. Jaffa believed that Lincoln's election and the statesmanship he displayed in leading the Union to victory in the Civil War had restored America's founding principles. But he believed that Lincoln had, in some sense, refounded America on a higher level, introducing Aristotelian principles to counter the corrosive elements of modernity that he believed had been inevitably present in the founding. In his last major work, A New Birth of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the Coming of Civil War, published in 2000, which I regard as his magnum opus, Dr. Jaffa revised his opinion of the American founding. What led him to this revision, I believe, was a better understanding, a deeper understanding of what Leo Strauss called the theological political question. New Birth is an extended, profound, and subtle rehearsal of that important question, the primary question that confronts political philosophy. Those Aristotelian elements Jaffa thought had been imported into the regime by Lincoln, he discovered had always been present in the founding. Dr. Jaffa argued that the American founding cannot be understood as simply an expression of modern natural right, that there are elements of classical natural right present in the founding which insulated it from the most corrosive effects of modernity. I believe this is the book, or nearly the book, that Leo Strauss would have written had his primary concern been the crisis of America rather than the crisis of the West. Many of Jaffa's critics have argued that America is a thoroughly modern regime based on low but solid principles. It is Machiavelli and Hobbes, they argue, who are the progenitors of America. But what Jaffa came to realize was that the important distinction in the history of political philosophy was not so much ancients and moderns as it was the quarrel between reason and revelation. Modernity, of course, attacked both reason and revelation as sources of moral and political authority. The American founding, according to Jaffa, appealed both to reason and revelation as its authoritative ground. the laws of nature and nature's God. The American founding, properly understood, provided the greatest antidote to the corrosive forces of modernity. This was Jaffa's deepest reason for defending the founding. Professor Jaffa devoted almost his entire career to explicating the character of the American founding. His text has been the Declaration of Independence. His many books and articles are the guide of the perplexed for those who seek to understand America's origin and America's principles. I fear we may not see his like again. His friends, his family, and his fellow citizens mourn the loss of this great man, this political philosopher, this remarkable American.
Well, I'm glad that we've heard from the family, and we'll also be hearing from others about Jaffa the man, the individual, the person. For me, the main thing has always been Jaffa the writer and the thinker, so I'll talk about that. I do want to preface that by saying I've always been, Jaffa's always been nothing but generous to me personally and to my family, and always welcomed me into his, for which I can only say that's a very rare thing to run into among professors, for sure. But for me, it was this, especially his interpretation of America and the problem of the best political order, that is the thing that struck me the most and has shaped my interest and in some ways my whole life. Jaffa's intellectual department, as we heard from Ed Erler a minute ago, was the encounter with Leo Strauss. And I think that in Jaffa's mind, that was the most important thing that ever happened to him, with the exception of his marriage and his family. Strauss taught Jaffa two big things that I think were very important to him. One is that political philosophy is possible. I mean that contrary to the almost universal opinion of Jaffa's day and of Strauss's day, there really is a rational case that can be made for natural right, the idea that there is such a thing as justice that is true for all men, all times. Strauss convinced Jaffa that the best case for natural right is found in the classical philosophers. Thus, Jaffa's lifelong interest in Plato and Aristotle, and also the way he treated Shakespeare as one of the classics too. Second, Strauss convinced Jaffa that the founding was profoundly defective. And I'll exaggerate for the sake of clarity by summarizing Strauss in this way. The founding, according to Strauss, was based on Locke. Locke followed Hobbes. Hobbes followed Machiavelli. Machiavelli grounded politics on low self-interest. So that was the problem that Strauss left Jaffa with. If the classics are the standard for us today, and if America was based on a rejection of the classics, then is there any way America can be defended? Jaffa's good friend Harry Newman often used the phrase the pre-Jaffa Jaffa to characterize Jaffa's scholarship pre-1975. Like other Straussians, Jaffa at first tried to defend America by looking for something in the regime that ennobled its supposedly base beginnings. For example, Harvey Mansfield thought he had found the ennobling element in the US Constitution, which in his view rescued America from the dangerous half-truth of equality in the Declaration of Independence. The pre-Jaffa Jaffa also found the ennobling of America in something outside the Declaration of Independence. But that was for him Lincoln. In Crisis of the House Divided, Lincoln was the statesman who transformed Jefferson's enlightened self-interest into a lofty moral goal for the nation. Sometime around 1975, Jaffa, as it were, became Jaffa. His long rethinking of the founding took place after that in 3 stages, and that's what I want to sketch quickly here. The first was exemplified by How to Think About the American Revolution, 1978. Here, various conservative intellectuals, Irving Kristol, Kendall Carey, Mel Bradford, had denied that the founding was based on natural rights at all. Martin Diamond had claimed that the Declaration of Independence provides almost no guidance regarding the structure of government. Jaffa took all these people on in this book and proved that they were wrong. More important, Jaffa tried to show, and I think made a good case for it, how the founding principles of equality and liberty were, if understood as the founders and Lincoln understood them, conservative principles. I mean, that Jaffa thought those principles once were and could once again become the basis of a good society in this country. Jaffa's revised approach meant that he no longer needed to vindicate America through Lincoln. The founding could be defended on its own terms. If you've seen some of the obituaries written recently by conservatives, such as Yuval Levin's and Richard Brookhiser's in National Review, you'll notice that Jaffa's Crisis of the House Divided is always highly praised, and the post-1975 writings are either not mentioned at all or are passed over with minimal comment. That's because most conservatives, to say nothing of liberals, do not like the political theory of the founding. And after 1975, after Jaffa embraced that theory, he had nothing but trouble with conservatives, and conservatives had nothing but trouble from him. The second stage of Jaffa's reassessment of the founding occurred in the Reagan years, when liberal attacks on the family and on Christianity grew increasingly strident. Jaffa became interested in the fact that the founders were pro-morality, pro-religion, and pro-heterosexual marriage, and talked about it a lot. Some scholars have argued that that means that the founding is an incoherent amalgam of non-Lockean moral and religious traditions with Lockean natural rights, and that happens to be the prevailing view among scholars today. Jaffa said no to that. He argued the founders' understanding was perfectly coherent, without citizen virtue, as the founders asserted, and as Jaffa used to quote, government cannot secure the people's natural rights. The two cannot be separated from one another. For conservative intellectuals like Alan Bloom and Robert Bork, however, the principles of the founding were a kind of time bomb unknowingly planted into our regime by the founders. The principles were ultimately destructive of everything good and decent. The radicals of the 1960s, Bloom wrote, quote, absolutized and radicalized the ideas of equality and freedom that were inherent in our regime, unquote. Jaffa was able to refute that claim decisively because he had rediscovered the moral dimension of the natural rights doctrine. The third and final stage of Jaffa's understanding was reached in the late 1980s and then continued on to be developed from there. The ennobling of the founding, which had been the earlier theme, is now replaced altogether. It is the founding itself which is the standard of noble politics in the modern world. Not only is the American regime not opposed to the classical understanding of politics, Jaffa now argued, it is even required by it in the conditions of the modern world. Jaffa argued that the classical political teaching of Aristotle had to be modified after the rise of Christianity because the new religion, Christianity, had severed the old connection between the gods and the city. In a world dominated by universalistic religion, a new ground for political obligation had to be found that was not tied to religious authority, and that was the laws of nature and of nature's God. The founders' doctrine of toleration, Jaffa now argued, eliminates salvation, by eliminating salvation of the soul as an end of politics, paradoxically elevates political life by removing from it a leading source of its degradation, namely persecution arising from the conviction of one's own sanctity. The founders' doctrine elevates politics by announcing a sacred cause, the cause of liberty, which elicits the noble virtues of statesmanship and citizenship. And finally, the social compact theory challenges men to live up to the moral demands required for the security of the rights of all. Those who complain that the founders reduced life to mere preservation neglect what the founders actually say. The purpose of politics, as the Declaration says, is safety and happiness. These, Jaffa writes in New Birth of Freedom, quote, are the alpha and omega of political life. That is, quote, liberty and property come to sight as the means to the preservation of life, but their enduring worth is in the service, not of mere life, but of the good or happy life. It is the natural order of the human wants directed towards their corresponding natural ends that constitute the architectonic principles of a society arising out of compact properly understood, unquote. And here in this last quote, we can see how Jaffa brings the political theory of the founding back around to the classical concern with philosophy as the highest way of life, concern which he had learned from Strauss. The soul of a true American, has a higher destiny than mere preservation or acquisition, although there is a place in America for those things too. Speaking for myself and for the many others who have learned so much from this brilliant man, let me conclude by saying thank you, Harry.
We're going to have a brief 15-minute pause now. Blue books will be passed out, and you will be asked to write on the lectures you just heard. I'm glad Philip said what he said about the G word and the lights, because when I came in and saw the bicycle here, I didn't quite know what to think. I'm basically a nice Catholic kid, and we generally don't have bicycles in the middle. But what do I know? But thank you, Philip, for reminding us that somebody had to turn the lights on. That's right. Good. I've been asked to say a few words about Harry the man and how I came to know him, and the early days of the graduate program. I take as my text, solet quaerere Jaffa pugnam, which all of you know, of course, means there's something about Jaffa that arouses disputes. It was an aphorism of which Leo Strauss was fond, but it was from the Middle Ages. It referred to Aristotle, and I've simply displaced Jaffa with Aristotle with Jaffa, a displacement that Harry would be very proud of, and perhaps indeed too proud. But more of that anon. He's the closest to Aristotle I would expect I would ever come to know. Well, we knew this day was coming, and we've known it for a long time. But given Harry's tenacity and remarkable mental acuity right up to almost the very end, the inevitability of the thing seemed to be perpetually postponed. But now the curtain has finally fallen, and we're going to have to adjust ourselves to not having him around, and that's going to be, for some of us, rather more difficult than perhaps we thought in the abstract. In the immediacy of death, the shadow of great men is longer sometimes than in life. And that will take some adjusting. You have a sense of what that adjusting will mean, and I will come back to this at the end, by hearing what Ed and Tom had to say about the nature and character of Harry's work, which will be a deeply rich and gratifying repository for future thought. There is hope. There will be hope because of what Harry did, and the whole new generation, or two or three of scholars, will be invited into that world that some of us were happy to know on a more personal level. What I'd like to do today is first to talk a little bit about my first encounter with Harry, and then about early life in the graduate program at Claremont, and then finally a few thoughts about the significance of it all. I first met Harry, I think, in 1965. I knew very little about him. I had read a few pieces in the National Review. I was aware that he had written the famous or infamous Goldwater speech, which was perfectly fine with me as a young Goldwaterite. I was rather proud of that distinction, and I had no difficulty with it whatsoever. I did remind him in our first conversation that on the night he was up all night drafting what came to be the speech, a group of us, fortified by considerable spirits, were having a rump session as to what the motto of the new party should be. In those days, of course, we were all accused of being flat earthers, of which we were very proud. And at the rump convention we had, various proposals were made about the motto. The one that carried the day was "In your heart, you know it's flat." But but I claim a certain literary elegance for my proposal was lost by a sizable vote, which was that you had nothing to sphere but sphere itself. So that Harry rather enjoyed that, and if he could figure out a way to have put it in the speech, he probably would have. We were on a panel at the Philadelphia Society, which consisted of Harry, me, and the late James Jackson Kilpatrick. And the topic was then a very hot topic in American law on the right to dissent. I forget what I said. It was not memorable. I forget what Harry said, but it was very gentle about what I said. What I do remember about that day is that the next 4 hours after the panel was set by my sitting across the table from Harry Jaffa, listening to him talk. Sentences, paragraphs, pages, texts, libraries came pouring out of this man on everything from contemporary politics, the pluses and minuses of National Review and William F. Buckley, the fate of the conservative movement, how William Shakespeare related to politics, how politics related to the Middle Ages, ancients and moderns. I'd never heard talk like this in my life, and it all ended up with some sort of road, if you followed all the links that somehow connected us sitting there in Chicago with Aristotle. This simply staggered me. I'd never seen anything like it in my life, and at the end of this 4-hour session, he said, you know, he said, if you're really interested in the kinds of questions you think you're interested in, you won't find the answers in law books and constitutional law cases. Why don't you come to Claremont to study the real thing? And in the course of the next year or so, with many, many phone calls, he simply beat me to death, and I had no choice but to arrive here wholly unprepared. I cannot tell you how little I knew about political philosophy. I was an ordinarily educated Yalie, which is to say I didn't know much about anything, like Phillips' motto on the office walls at Ohio State. But I thought I did until I met Harry, and then I realized how little I knew and how much I had to learn. I did a quick read of Crisis before coming to Claremont, and a quick read of natural right and history. That's about all I knew about political philosophy when I arrived here. And then I ran into the likes of West and Erler and a few others who are here today who really had studied this stuff. And I felt about this big. It remained about that big for the duration of my time here. And the truth be told, I learned as much from them as almost as I did from Harry. Harry's teaching style was, shall we say, not exactly exciting. That isn't why we celebrated him. He was not a dramatic lecturer. Ed said he got through 2 books of the Republic. Well, that was a good semester. What you got mostly was Harry Jaffa on life, which meant Harry Jaffa on the book you were studying, Harry Jaffa on the book you will study sometime in the future, Harry Jaffa on the book you should have read 5 years ago, Harry Jaffa on Churchill, Shakespeare, William F. Buckley, the medievals, the difference between Aquinas and Aristotle, and all roads leading back ultimately to Plato and Aristotle, and why didn't we know more? Thank you very much. It didn't matter what the class was. It all had, in a sense, that same grand, large theme, and you left always hungry for more, and you had chastised yourself constantly that you were so ignorant. And for that, I thank him. He did so very gently. Harry was not for all his reputation as a cantankerous man, and he was cantankerous, but never with his students. Never with his students. He was kind and gentle. I came away from that first meeting with 2 firm conclusions. That this man was one of the most brilliant, if not the most brilliant man I had ever encountered. And number 2, he was wonderfully kind and generous. He, after all, put up with me for 3 or 4 hours. And that was basically the bet I made when I came to Claremont, and I never had reason to regret it. After coming here, both of those hunches were marvelously confirmed, both his brilliance and his kindness and his generosity, and doubly so because Marjorie, like Harry, opened her heart and her house to all of us. It was our second home. Boffman Drive was, well, the refrigerator was always open and well stocked. The conversation was also open and well stocked, whether it took place in the living room or that cramped study down the hall. At all hours of day and night, that was simply where we learned, and learned in a lot of ways as much as, if not more, than we learned in the actual classroom. Harry was a marvelous writer. It's not frequently enough remarked. He was a beautiful rhetorician. His prose was crisp and clear. It came out of his study of English at Yale, I'm convinced, and his mastery of Shakespeare and his familiarity with the King James Bible, which he also learned from a common teacher we had at Yale, Alex Witherspoon, who taught Harry Milton 20-odd years before, and I had his last class on Milton when I was in New Haven. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer from which I've learned much. He tended to overuse the exclamation point, a bad habit I tried to cure him of numerous times without success. And even less successfully did I succeed in attempting him to lower the temperature on some of those adjectives and adverbs and maybe even nouns with which he cantankerously castigated his friendly enemies. I didn't succeed on that front either. On the other hand, neither did anyone else. Almost certainly Harry's reputation of the world would be better off without that, but as I say, solet Jaffa quae rere pugnam, that's part of who he was. He loved disputation, but it wasn't the whole man. The New York Times obituary was surprisingly generous in space to Harry. It has, like many obituaries about him, devoted an undue amount of time to the Goldwater speech. Harry has explained that more than a few times, and I think for the most part, well, if not absolutely compellingly. His involvement in politics, beginning with the Goldwater caper, was something of an embarrassment to some of his fellow academics and even some of his friendly Straussian acquaintances. But beneath all of that political passion and folderol, which others found embarrassing, there was a deeper lesson, and Tom and Ed have both alluded to it. Harry was prescient in the understanding, before almost anybody else, save perhaps Leo Strauss, and perhaps even including Leo Strauss, at sensing the fault line, the deep fault line in American politics, which threatened to swallow the founding principles and any sense of moral objectivity. He saw that early on, and he saw the Democratic Party as abandoning the founding principles before almost anybody else. When many of his colleagues were still enamored of Adlai Stevenson, God save us all, or more civilly, John F. Kennedy, Harry had already begun his hegira to the Republican Party. And his involvement with Goldwater was therefore no accident. The Republican Party was, in many respects, then and now, nothing to write home about, but if there was any chance to save the regime from the shortcomings of democratic folly, it would lie in the party of Lincoln, revivified, he hoped, by a renewed understanding of the principles which led to the founding of the party, and to which Abraham Lincoln gave his life, and to which Harry Jaffa gave his life, in a way. Say what you will about the Goldwater speech. 10 years on, Harry's sense of the Democratic Party would be dramatically fulfilled. Within 10 years, that party had become thoroughly McGovernized from top to bottom in a race toward a kind of madness, a nihilistic madness, by virtue of which 10 years after that, the Democratic Party as an institution is embarrassed by and almost anything that used to be celebrated under the banner of American exceptionalism. The speed with which that happened shocked, I think, almost everybody except Harry. So the grand old party, such as it is, on crutches, is in some respects our last best hope, as Lincoln is our last best teacher, enlightened by the instruction of Harry Jaffa. I think in the long run, I defer to others on this, but Harry's understanding of the Declaration and the understanding of Lincoln are about as permanent as any lesson that has been taught in our lifetime, and I think will last. Whatever happens to the regime in the near term or even the longer term, there is that body of work that can be consulted by thoughtful people and will be consulted. Hillsdale College, which will now have Harry's papers, can become the Huntington Library of the revival of the American regime. And I've cautioned Larry Arnn to make sure he adds a big archival building, donated, we trust, by a very rich donor, to make sure that the the Jaffa collection at Hillsdale becomes the counterparts of the Huntington, and therein may lie the salvation of the country. What I should like to do in closing is to bring to your attention something that fits Harry, I think, like a tea, and it comes from Abraham Lincoln's eulogy to Henry Clay. Let me recall that for you. He loved his country partly because it was his own country, but mostly because it was a free country. And he burned with great zeal for its advancement, prosperity, and glory, because he saw in the advancement, prosperity, and glory of human liberty, human right, and human nature. What Lincoln said of Clay could be said of Harry. And with your leave, and with the leave of the great bicycle, I should now like to offer a blessing. May the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob smile upon Harry Jaffa and grant his soul eternal rest in the garden where Jerusalem and Athens are forever joined in harmonious conversation about whatsoever things are true. Thank you.
We do have, Mike, a gift coming in, a bequest for some years now for an archive building. And there will be a Jaffa room in that building. And we might talk somebody out of that bicycle, I don't know. When I met your father, Karen, in the summer of 1974, he was wearing a white shirt and black socks and a pair of boxer shorts. Peter Schramm did me the honor of asking me to come pick him up. I was newly arrived, to take him to the first class, and he didn't fully remember that he had a class, and he didn't remember who I was, and he didn't remember what the class was about. And I thought, goodness, what have I done? I remember everything he said in that first class. It was on the ethics. We didn't get out of book 1, Ed. He said, when men get to be old men like me, I'm now older than he was then, he said, they make a list of the 100 greatest books. But life is too short to read 100 books. No one can know 100 great books. He said, I have a list of the 3 greatest books. I'll tell you sometime the list, it's ambiguous. The ethics is certainly included in Plato's Republic. What did I learn from that? I learned that there's some things so precious and they're written down that you must give your life to them. And there can only be a few. And that to live a good life was to live that way. That was the first thing I learned from him. Condolences to you and your children, you 3. He taught us that family was so important because understanding starts and also ends with understanding of the good. And he loved you all and your children very much. I thank you, Ed, for your work for Professor Jaffa. Carry a special burden. There are 3 things I think that I have had a special opportunity to see in Harry Jaffa, and I'm going to describe 2 of them. I'm not going to talk about Churchill because I don't want to be accused of doing what he did in his eulogy of Strauss and talking about myself. But I have studied Churchill for 40 years and discovered that Professor Jaffa was right. In the summer of 1976, one of those pivotal moments came that Tom West described so well. I would ride bikes with him most days with Ed, and then I would, before or after, go to his house and sit and listen to him read for an hour to 2 hours from this paper that he was writing. This paper was above all about Irving Kristol. He told me in an interview that we did for the Claremont Institute a few years ago that he wrote the end of Crisis in the House divided the way he did because his fellow students of Strauss were the ones who had studied the American Revolution, and he had taken it that they were right. But in the years that passed, he had been reading it himself, and this great bicentennial lecture that Crystal gave in Independence Hall for the American Enterprise Institute set him off. "This is wrong," he said. I think he wrote 136 pages, if memory serves, an APSA paper to give in San Francisco on a panel of which Irving Kristol was the chair. And there were 400 people there. The room was packed. And I will always remember Professor Jaffa best as he was reading that paper to me. Sometimes he would stand up and march around. And then as he was giving the paper at the panel, it's one of the most exciting things I've seen in my life. He was vibrant and full of energy. It was electric. And he would every day find some new thing to prove that this story of America, in which, by the way, he himself had cooperated, was wrong, and the story was better than that. And at the paper, I told him later, I remember Irving Kristol said, one of the things he said, and I met Martin Diamond for the only time in my life outside that panel, and he didn't come in. I mentioned it to Professor Jaffa. Later, I thought it was disappointing that he didn't come in. He should have come in. And Professor Jaffa's response was, of course he didn't come in. Irving Kristol said, "I don't understand this, Harry," he said. "I've been learning from you for 30 years. And Professor Jaffa, who was, the podium over here, and the panelists were sitting, and when they were and the question and answer was on for a long time. Professor, you'd go to and the professor would spring to the panel. It looked like he reached it in a single step. And his response was, "Yeah, but you didn't understand, Irving," he said. It was exciting in part because he was so exciting at this time. And as Mike Uhlmann rightly said, he wasn't always exciting in class. He wasn't very organized, except that sometimes there would be these classes and you would walk out to be surprised that it was dark because we'd been there an hour and a half too long and nobody remembered. And he told us what human reason is. "What is it," he would say, "that a man can do that a dog cannot? What if you had a ring that you could disappear and have any power you wanted? What would you do with it?" That started once with an undergraduate and went on till 6 o'clock at night. And what restraint would there be on you? How would you pick? Of course, that's one of Socrates' questions. Came to a head here in this summer of 1976 in the paper that he gave. And of course, it's the reason he became notorious, also famous if you look at the obituaries of lately. And he was so proud of that because he was standing up for something, his country, which he loved, and explaining it, but of course all those larger things that one reaches by going through one's country and the law. If the question is the good, the answer is in politics, the authoritative and first answer. I think those were earth-shaking days, and I think if we are able to save our country, which we may not be, I think that those days will be there at the foundation of saving it. And I think if we don't, we can still understand better. And then later, when somebody gets another chance, they can look at that. The second thing I'll mention that I have, of which I have firsthand knowledge, is I have been ordered about by Professor Jaffa probably more than any living man. And the reason is it fell to me to manage the Claremont Institute for a long time. And he regarded it as his own, as he was right to do. And so there's no estimating the hours that I have spent listening to him tell me what to do. And I came to think of him as having a grand strategy. I often disagreed with him and often didn't do what he said. But it was always interesting to hear him. We had a couple of conflicts. And 3 I can think of, and 2 of them started down that road where he writes you a letter and quotes something you said, invites him to answer you, and then he'll write about that answer, and then you'll be at war with him. And he'll humiliate you or make you agree. And I still have those letters, every letter he ever wrote me, and the ones I wrote back to him. And in those cases, I wrote back in the same form. I've looked at them lately. I wrote him back and I said, "Dear Professor," I said, "I do in fact agree with you about this point." I said, "And it just so happens to fall to me to decide what's to be done about that agreement. It is a responsibility of mine. And you cannot take that from me. And therefore you cannot have the authority. And I have not been taught by my teachers to cower." I've written things like that to him twice. And both times he called me immediately on reading it. And his first words, both times, I'll remember them till the day I die, was, "Very good," he said. The crisis was over. It proves, by the way, that he was not a bully or a bad man. Once Ursula Mies sat down to me beside me at breakfast at a conference just before Ed Mies walked up and sat down, and her first words, "Good morning, Harry Jaffa is a bad man." And I said, "No, ma'am, he is not." And she said, "Well, why can he say these things about my husband?" And I said, some of those things that he said about your husband, I don't agree with. As you know, I wrote something about it. But he actually is right about the point, with Ed Mies sitting there, who's a friend of mine today and was then. And Ed said, "Explain that." And I said, "Well, sir," I said, "you have given 2 speeches about the Declaration of Independence, and they are mutually exclusive, as Professor Jaffa has pointed out, and that means that you can't be right in both places. And he's daring you to state which. And he's even trying to force you to state which is his way." And he said, Ed Mies, who's a very gentle and fine man, said, "Well, there may be something to that," he said. Over that issue, Professor Jaffa called me on the phone one time, and he had decided that I had to write an introduction to one of those things he published as president of the Claremont Institute. And I agreed to do it, and I did write it, and in the introduction, you can go look it up. I agree with Professor Jaffa, but he didn't like the tone that I took about Ed Mies. He wanted it to be more like his tone. And so he's mentioned this to me 2 or 3 times with insistence, and then one day he called me. I was sitting in my office on First Street, and he talked. I started timing it. I had him on the speakerphone, and I was working. And he talked for 40 minutes without interruption. And he did a rare thing. He said, "Damn it," twice into the phone. And he finally, ran down a bit and stopped, and I said, "Have you finished?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Professor, I'll answer you briefly." I said, "You've called me up and you've actually cursed at me, which you usually don't. And you've told me that I have to do something." And I replied that I do not. And I put the phone down. And I got home at night, and this happened a lot too, and he called up, and I can mimic the tones in his voice when he talked on the phone, especially his greeting. "Larry?" And I said, "Professor." He said, "This is the Queen calling." And I said, "The Queen?" He said, "Yes." He said, "You're the Prime Minister. You get to do what you want, but you have to spend time talking to the Queen." And I said, "What would the Queen have with me tonight?" It was like, I look at the rabbi over here, it was running the Claremont Institute was like being the Jews, right? It's hard duty to get chosen. One of Professor Jaffa's favorite thing to say. Why did he care about this? I think the answer is the same as the reason he cared about Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. He loved them with all his heart. They were causes to him. I think I can put the argument together. I think the question of the good is the first question. I think it issues, if one can find it, in beauty and truth. I think that one approaches it through the law, which makes the authoritative statements. I think that we humans, even so great a human as Harry Jaffa and his greatest heroes, can't really command all of nature. We approach it through our good and our place in nature. And so he thought that the job was to put together an argument to vindicate the goodness of the heroes who made our country and the workings of our country so that there could still be civilization and freedom and justice after the time that philosophy has gone off the rails so badly that it led one of the greatest thinkers in the 20th century to join the party that sought the life of Professor Jaffa's teacher. I think, like Strauss, Professor Jaffa sought to solve that problem. And I think he had a soul, the only one I've ever met among thinkers, that was big enough to address itself to that problem. And we are less without him. And we thank God for him.